The first time I ever went camping alone, I told myself it would be the perfect reset. A few days without screens, without people, just me and the woods. I had spent years going to the same national park with my family, but this time I wanted solitude. There was something almost sacred about it, being completely off-grid, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. I left on a Friday afternoon in late September, just as the leaves began to burn orange and red. The drive took me through long, winding back roads where the forest pressed right up against the asphalt, thick enough to feel like driving through a tunnel made of branches. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw, until finally there were no houses, no phone service, just the sound of gravel under my tires. I'd researched a site online called Hollow Pines, a small campground that apparently hadn't been maintained in years. People said it was quiet and secluded, the kind of place hunters or loners used to go. The road leading in was half covered by weeds, and the old wooden sign at the entrance had been bleached gray by the sun. When I parked, the world fell silent. No wind, no birds, just stillness. I remember thinking that it was peaceful, the kind of peace that feels heavy, like it's waiting for something to break it. I set up my tent near a clearing beside an old fire pit. The trees were unusually tall there, straight, pale trunks that rose high before bursting into a dense canopy. They looked wrong somehow, too symmetrical, as if they'd been planted deliberately in neat rows a century ago. By dusk, the forest started to hum, not with noise, but with energy, the way forests do when the air cools and the light fades and everything starts to move. The occasional snap of a twig, a distant owl, the creak of wood shifting. I sat by my small fire, cooking canned chili, feeling proud of myself for making it out here alone. It wasn't until around 10 p.m. that I heard the first sound. It was faint, somewhere behind my tent, a soft shuffle, then a slow, dragging crunch of leaves. My body reacted before my mind did. Every hair stood up. I turned off my lantern and listened. The forest was too quiet again. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a raccoon. I'd come here for isolation. That meant nature too. Still, I kept the fire burning higher that night and didn't sleep much. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, closer, just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. It wasn't walking normally. The sound came in uneven bursts. Shuffle, pause, shuffle, as if someone was dragging their foot, taking slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath. My flashlight lay by my side, but I didn't dare turn it on. After what felt like a full minute, the sound stopped. No breathing, no movement, just that heavy silence pressing down. Then came the soft sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. I froze. It was like a hand, or maybe a branch, gliding along the fabric, slow and curious. My pulse thudded in my ears. I wanted to unzip the tent, to shout, to do something, but fear locked me in place. And then, as quietly as it had come, it stopped. When morning came, I stepped out and inspected the ground. There were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing. The only marks in the soil were my own. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling that something had been standing there, inches away, watching me. I told myself it was probably nerves. First night alone in the woods, it made sense to imagine things. I spent the morning hiking deeper along a barely visible trail that led away from camp. The forest was beautiful, but strange. Every few hundred feet, I found evidence that someone had been there long ago. Old fire rings, collapsed wooden posts, bits of rusted metal buried in leaves. At one point, I stumbled upon something I'll never forget. A clearing, perfectly circular, about 30 feet wide. In the center was a single tree stump, blackened and split as if struck by lightning. Around it, a ring of stones had been placed, too deliberate to be natural. Each stone had a symbol carved into it, crude, hand-chiseled shapes that looked like triangles and spirals. I felt an immediate urge to leave. It wasn't fear exactly, more like I had stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I turned back toward camp, realizing I had wandered farther than I meant to. The forest felt denser now. Shadows pooled between the trees even though it was midday. When I finally saw the outline of my tent again, I stopped dead. Something had changed. The fire pit I'd built the night before was gone. The stones had been moved, rearranged into a different pattern, similar to the ones I'd seen in that clearing. I remember standing there for a full minute, my mind refusing to make sense of it. There was no wind strong enough to move those rocks, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. That night, I decided I wasn't staying another one. I packed my gear, but it was already getting dark. I figured I'd sleep a few hours and drive out at first light. I didn't even bother lighting a fire. I just sat inside my tent, clutching a flashlight, listening. At around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. But this time, there were more than one. 2, maybe 3. Slow, synchronized steps circling the tent. The sound of weight pressing into soil, moving just beyond the thin nylon barrier between us. No voices, no breathing, just that eerie, deliberate movement. Then something tapped against the tent wall. Once, twice. I nearly dropped my flashlight when it flickered on. The beam caught the thin fabric of the tent, and for a second I saw shadows. 3 distinct human shapes, tall and motionless, standing just a few feet away. I couldn't see faces, only outlines. One of them seemed to be holding something, long and narrow, like a branch or a staff. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat locked up completely. The shapes didn't move. They just stood there, as if waiting. Then, without warning, they backed away, soundlessly, melting into the dark. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light hit, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The ground was disturbed. Dozens of footprints leading out into the forest. Bare feet. I didn't even bother taking my tent down. I threw everything into the car and started driving. But when I reached the main dirt road leading out, I stopped. Something was wrong. The trees looked different, closer together. The sunlight didn't fall the same way, and the road, it didn't look like the one I'd driven in on. The tracks from my car were gone. I drove for what felt like an hour, but the path kept twisting, looping, bringing me back to the same stretch of trees. That's when I saw it. My campsite. I swear I'd been driving straight away from it, yet there it was. My tent, collapsed and empty, the remnants of my fire pit sitting exactly as I'd left them. Except now, there was something new beside it. A wooden structure, crudely built, maybe 4 feet tall. Twigs, rope, and strips of bark woven together in the shape of a small hut. Hanging from it were small objects, bones, feathers, and pieces of cloth.
I'd always preferred camping near water. Lakes have a way of calming me. That mirror smooth surface, the hum of insects, the quiet sense that time itself slows down. So when I found a small blue shape on an old printed map, labeled simply Unnamed Lake, I knew I had to find it. The road to get there didn't technically exist anymore. Half the pavement had been swallowed by roots and gravel. My car bumped over ruts for almost an hour before the GPS lost signal completely. When I finally parked, it was late afternoon and the forest was breathing mist. The air felt heavy, colder than it should have been in June. The scent of wet pine was almost metallic, sharp in my lungs. I hiked for about 2 miles, following a faint path that seemed more like an animal trail than something made for people. The woods thickened as I went. No birds, no wind, just my footsteps and the occasional creak of shifting branches overhead. When I reached the lake, I stopped short. It was smaller than I expected, but eerily perfect. A round basin of still black water surrounded by tall trees leaning inward like they were all trying to look at their own reflection. No ripples, no current, just a sheet of glass. I set my tent on a patch of moss a few feet from the shore. The ground was soft, almost spongy, but I didn't mind. I cooked a quick meal, watched the last light fade, and listened to the forest start its nighttime chorus. Except here, it didn't sound right. Usually when darkness settles, you hear layers, frogs, crickets, rustling leaves. But at this lake, it was just one sound, a low, constant hum that came from the water itself. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't bugs, it was deeper, almost electrical, like a faint vibration. The hum grew stronger after midnight. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound seemed to pulse, like it was alive. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence again. A moment later, I heard something splash. A small, quick disturbance, as if a single stone had been dropped into the center of the lake. The ripples spread outward, catching the moonlight. But what bothered me most was how still the air was. There was no wind to make waves. I told myself it was a fish, maybe a frog. Still, I couldn't fall asleep. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of standing knee-deep in the water. Something cold brushed against my leg. Not slimy, not fish-like, something smooth and deliberate. When I looked down, the reflection staring back wasn't mine. I woke before sunrise, sweating. The forest was gray and hushed, the lake absolutely still again. For a while I just sat there staring at that perfect black surface, feeling watched but not seeing anyone. I thought about leaving, but curiosity has a way of overriding reason. I decided to stay one more night. I spent the morning hiking the perimeter of the lake. It was smaller than it looked, maybe half a mile across, but what struck me was how symmetrical it was. The shoreline curved in an almost perfect circle. The trees closest to the waterline was stripped of lower branches, all cut at the same height, as if trimmed by a machine. About halfway around, I found something strange. A second tent. It was old, faded canvas, half collapsed, coated in green moss. Nearby lay a rusted camping stove, a torn backpack, and an empty canteen. The zipper was open, and inside were only leaves and dirt. It looked abandoned for years, but there were footprints in the mud, fresh ones, bare feet. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, not even birds. The hum had started again, faint but steady, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I backed away and returned to my own camp. The hum grew louder by evening. It wasn't constant anymore. It pulsed in intervals, almost like a heartbeat. Every time it throbbed, the surface of the lake rippled outward, even though no stone had touched it. By nightfall, the air itself felt charged. My lantern light seemed weaker, my fire reluctant to stay lit. I ate without appetite, glancing every few seconds toward the water. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a shape standing on the opposite shore, tall, human, perfectly still. When I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was a shadow, my mind filling in shapes where none existed. But as the hours passed, the unease deepened into something physical. The smell of the lake changed. The air took on a faint rot, like algae mixed with metal. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 3 a.m., the hum reached its peak, a trembling resonance that made the tent fabric quiver. The ground seemed to breathe beneath me, rising and falling ever so slightly. And then came the sound that froze me completely. Footsteps in the water. Slow, measured steps, each one followed by a soft splash, as if someone were walking straight toward shore. I held my breath. The splashing stopped just beyond the tent wall. For a long time, there was nothing. Then something pressed lightly against the outside of the fabric, a smooth curve like a palm dragging slowly along the surface. The hum stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for it to move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have blacked out. When daylight came, everything looked untouched. No footprints, no disturbance. The lake was calm again, but smaller. The shoreline had drawn inward by several feet, as though the water level had dropped overnight. The mud revealed thin shapes beneath the surface. Roots, maybe, or bones. I couldn't tell. I decided then I was done. Packing was clumsy with shaking hands. I wanted to be gone before the hum started again. But when I tried to leave, I couldn't find the trail. The woods looked identical in every direction. My compass spun uselessly. Panic crept in. I circled back to the lake 3 times without meaning to. It was as if the forest had closed around it. By noon, I stumbled on a narrow path I didn't remember seeing before. I followed it blindly. It sloped upward through dense pine and ended at a wooden post driven into the ground. A small rusted sign was nailed to it. The letters were barely visible, but I could make out one word: condemned. Beyond the post, the forest thinned, and I finally saw my car through the trees. Relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I didn't stop moving until I was miles away. That night, safe in my apartment, I told myself it had all been stress, imagination, the mind playing tricks in isolation. I deleted the old map file from my phone and promised I'd never chase unnamed places again. 2 weeks later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize.
It started as a simple weekend trip. I'd been feeling burnt out after weeks of non-stop work, so when my friend recommended a forest preserve a few hours north that was criminally underused, it sounded perfect. Quiet, isolated, surrounded by nature. I left early Saturday morning, the car loaded with a tent, food, and enough gear for 2 nights. The drive took longer than expected. Narrow roads winding through farmland that eventually turned into stretches of pine and birch. When I reached the turnoff for the forest, the paved road gave way to dirt, and I didn't pass another car for nearly an hour. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the afternoon light had softened to that golden hue you only see in the woods. Everything smelled like sap and damp soil. There was a single sign nailed to a tree, "Clear Water Preserve," though the paint was cracked and fading. I signed in at the empty ranger box, took a photo of the crude map posted beside it, and started hiking. The trail was well marked at first, following the bend of a creek before cutting deeper into the trees. The sound of running water faded the farther I went, replaced by the steady crunch of boots over fallen leaves. By the time I arrived at the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the forest had swallowed every trace of the world I'd left behind. The site was perfect: open ground, soft soil, and a small pond reflecting the dim sky. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and sat listening to the forest come alive with its nighttime rhythm. Except, something about it was wrong. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't still. The woods were alive in a way that didn't feel natural. The air itself seemed to vibrate, not from sound, but from motion. If I focused long enough, I could hear faint rustling that never stopped. It wasn't the kind that came and went with the wind. It was continuous, as if every part of the forest was shifting in slow, constant movement. It made no sense. I'd camped countless times before. Forests go silent at night, except for the occasional call or crack. But this one never stopped breathing. I stayed by the fire longer than usual, comforted by its light. My phone had no service, but that was expected. Before turning in, I walked to the pond for water. That was when I noticed something. The reflection in the water didn't match the sky above it. The pond should have been showing a patch of stars, but instead it looked clouded, as if something darker than night sat beneath the surface. I knelt closer and realized the reflection was moving. Not rippling, but shifting on its own. I backed away, trying to tell myself it was just the angle of light, some illusion of depth. I returned to the tent and zipped it closed, forcing myself not to look back. I didn't sleep much. All night I kept hearing the soft, constant rustling, like leaves brushing against each other just beyond the tent fabric. Sometimes it seemed to circle around the site. I told myself it was small animals, maybe wind through the brush, but I knew it wasn't. It was too steady, too deliberate. By sunrise, the sound had stopped. The forest looked almost normal again. The pond was clear, reflecting bright daylight this time. I laughed at myself for overreacting and spent the morning hiking one of the side trails that looped toward the western ridge. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds stopped calling. Around noon, I found something that made my skin crawl. Half hidden under a pile of leaves was an old camping backpack. It was shredded across the back panel, the straps ripped clean through. Nearby, I found a boot, moldy, half-buried, laces still tied. No bones, no clothing, just the bag and boot. I left everything as it was and returned to camp, my sense of calm gone completely. The forest looked the same as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in my absence. My tent was there, but my fire camp had been smothered. I didn't do that. There were footprints in the dirt, circling my site. Bare feet, pressed deep into the soil. I froze where I stood. The prints led to the pond and stopped at the edge. The water was calm, perfectly flat again. I should have left right then, but it was already late in the afternoon, and the idea of hiking the trail back in the dark made my stomach twist. I told myself I'd go at first light. As the sun fell behind the trees, the rustling began again. This time, it came from every direction. The air felt thicker, as if the forest was pressing in. Even the flames of my new fire seemed reluctant to rise, flickering low despite the dry wood. The
The sound wasn't just leaves anymore. It was deeper, a slow, dragging sound, like roots being pulled through the soil. The pond reflected nothing now. It looked like a hole, a piece of sky without stars. I tried to distract myself by writing notes in my phone, but even the light from the screen felt intrusive in that darkness. I shut it off and sat completely still, listening. Hours passed. Then I realized the forest wasn't making the noise anymore. The sound was coming from underneath me. The ground was moving, subtle, rhythmic. I pressed my hand into the dirt and felt it vibrate. Something was shifting below the surface, slow, deliberate, alive. I scrambled to my feet and back toward the tent. The earth pulsed once like a breath, and the fire dimmed almost to black. Then I heard the pond. Not the water itself, something moving through it. The surface bulged outward as if something enormous had risen from beneath. I couldn't see what it was, only that the water had begun spilling over the edge, crawling toward my tent like slow, dark fingers. I ran into the trees with nothing but my flashlight. Every few seconds I glanced back, and each time the darkness seemed closer. The flashlight flickered. When it came back on, I wasn't on the trail anymore. The woods were unfamiliar. No markers, no sign of the pond or campsite, just trees, all leaning slightly toward me, like they had grown that way. The ground beneath them was moving. The roots rose and fell like the pulse of something buried alive. I kept walking until I couldn't feel my legs. Eventually, the sound faded. The forest went still. I collapsed against a tree and waited for morning. When dawn came, I realized I had wandered in a circle. The pond was only a few yards ahead of me, but it wasn't a pond anymore. The water had receded overnight, leaving a hollow depression of slick black mud. In the center stood my tent, collapsed, half sunken, as if the ground had swallowed it from beneath. There were shapes in the mud, not footprints, not animals, shapes like bodies, half-formed, pressing upward from below the surface. The faces weren't human anymore, stretched, elongated, their features warped into something that looked sculpted by water. I turned and ran. It took me nearly 4 hours to find the trail again. When I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. When I got home, I told myself I was done camping. I deleted every photo I'd taken from that trip. But the strange part was that when I tried to pull up the map I'd taken a picture of, it wasn't in my phone anymore. Not in storage, not in the cloud. Gone. Curious, I searched online for Clearwater Preserve. Nothing came up, not even a mention. The next night, I couldn't sleep. My apartment felt oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring.